The gavel came down like a gunshot and Louisa Atwood flinched. Not because the sound startled her, she had heard worse sounds, far worse in the years before she arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, but because the man standing 3 feet to her left had just turned and looked directly at her, and his eyes were the color of dark river water, deep and still and impossible to look away from. He had been watching her, not the cattle, not the auctioneer, not the broad-shouldered ranchers hollering numbers into the dry September air of 1882. He had been watching her, and he had noticed something that no one else at this livestock auction had bothered to notice at all. He had noticed that she was not watching the auction. She was watching the man in the second row, the man with the silver watch chain and the gray suit that cost more than most men in this county earned in a month. The man whose name was Edgar Holt, and whose handshake Louisa Atwood had been forced to accept 4 days ago in the back office of a solicitor she had never met before. The man who had purchased her father's land deed, the deed to 140 acres of good Kansas bottomland, for 20 cents on the dollar, using a contract her father had signed without fully understanding, 3 weeks before he died. The man with the dark river eyes leaned just slightly toward her. He did not touch her. He simply said quietly under the noise of the auction, "You are not here for the cattle." It was not a question. Louisa kept her eyes forward. "Neither are you," she said. He was quiet for one long moment. The auctioneer called another lot. A horse trader from Sumner County raised his hand. "My name is Benjamin Redmond," the man said. "I own the Redmond Cattle Company 3 miles north on the Salt Fork. I am absolutely here for the cattle." He paused. "But I noticed you first." She should have walked away. She had promised herself, in the terrible months since her father's funeral, that she would not trust a single soul until she had her land back, her name cleared, and her feet on solid ground. She had built walls around herself as deliberately and as carefully as she had once tended her father's garden. Quiet was her armor. Stillness was her weapon. But Benjamin Redmond had seen through both in under 30 seconds, and that terrified her more than Edgar Holt's silver watch chain ever had. She finally turned and looked at him fully. He was tall. Not imposingly so, but tall in the way of men who had worked outside their whole lives, with a lean frame that suggested endurance rather than brute strength. He had dark hair going a little gray at the temples, though he could not have been much past 35. His face was weathered and honest and held no performance in it whatsoever. He looked at her with the straightforward attention of a man who had decided, in some private and unannounced way, that she mattered. "Louisa Atwood," she said, because it seemed only fair. "I know who you are," Benjamin said quietly. "I knew your father. He was a good man." Something in her chest cracked open, just barely, like a fault line shifting deep beneath the ground. She pressed it closed again. "Then you know what Edgar Holt did to him," she said. Benjamin Redmond looked across the auction yard to where Edgar Holt was laughing with 2 men near the far fence, his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and his silver watch chain catching the afternoon light. "I know some of it," Benjamin said. "I suspect I do not know all of it." "No," Louisa said softly. "You do not." She had not meant it as an invitation. But the way he received it, with patience, without pressing, without the dangerous entitled curiosity she had come to expect from men who thought her situation made her available, made it feel, despite everything she had promised herself, like one. Thomas Atwood had come to Kansas in 1868, when Louisa was 8 years old, on a wagon from Missouri with a wife who was already sick and a dream that was already older than the territory itself. He had found his land on the Salt Fork of the Arkansas, rich dark soil that flooded black in spring and held water through summer like a blessing. He had built a house on it. He had buried his wife on it. He had raised his daughter on it, alone, through drought and grasshopper plague, and the long silence of grief that settles over a man when the person he built everything for is gone. Louisa had grown up in that silence. She had learned to read the land the way other children learn to read books. She knew which cottonwood meant water nearby. She knew which clouds brought hail. She knew when the creek was rising before it rose, and she knew when her father was struggling before he said so, which in the end meant she always knew because he never said so. By the time Louisa was 23, she could manage the farm and keep the books and ride a horse as well as any man in the county, and she had the kind of quiet competence that made people underestimate her and the kind of clear eyes that made certain people nervous. Edgar Holt was one of those people. He had been circling her father's land for 2 years before Thomas Atwood's heart gave out in October of 1881, and he had moved with the speed and efficiency of a carrion bird the moment the news was out. The contract her father had signed was real. Louisa had read it 100 times, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, her hands flat on the paper as if she could press the truth out of it through sheer will. It was a loan agreement, signed in January of 1881, for $300 against the land deed. Her father had needed money for seed and equipment after a bad harvest, and Holt had offered terms that sounded reasonable in the cold of January and were brutal on paper in the warmth of May. There was a clause buried in the document on the 4th page, in smaller print, surrounded by language that looped back on itself like a snake eating its own tail, that transferred the deed to Holt's land holding company if the loan was not paid in full, plus 20% interest, within 12 months of signing. Thomas Atwood had not understood the clause, or perhaps he had been too tired and too proud to ask for help reading it. Or perhaps he had simply believed, as men of his generation sometimes did, that a handshake was a handshake and a gentleman was a gentleman, even when neither of those things was true. Louisa had spent the winter after his death trying to find a lawyer who would challenge the contract. The first one she approached in Caldwell told her the document was legal and there was nothing to be done. The second one in Wellington said the same thing, though he had the decency to look sorry about it. The third was Edgar Holt's personal attorney, and she had only gone to him to confirm what she already suspected, that this was not bad luck. It was a trap. The contract had been designed, from the beginning, to fail. She had come to the auction not to bid on anything. She had come because she had heard from the blacksmith's wife that Edgar Holt would be here, and that he had been telling people he planned to sell off the Atwood land by the end of the year, parcel by parcel, to whoever would pay. She had come because she needed to see his face. She needed to understand the scale of what she was dealing with. She needed to know if there was any fear in him at all, any crack in his confidence, anything she could use. There was not. He was as comfortable as a man who had never been wrong about anything in his life, and that terrified her. She told all of this to Benjamin Redmond, not that day at the auction but 3 days later, in the kitchen of the boarding house where she was staying, because he had come to find her. He had ridden into Caldwell on a roan horse with a quietness of purpose that she recognized because it was her own, and he had asked the boarding house keeper, Mrs. Elspeth Crane, if Miss Atwood was available to receive a visitor, and when Mrs. Crane had come upstairs to ask, Louisa had stood at her small window for a long moment and looked out at him in the yard below. He had taken off his hat while he waited. He was looking at nothing in particular. He was not impatient. She went downstairs. They sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Crane's coffee between them, and Louisa told him about the contract because she was running out of time and running out of options, and because something in the directness of his attention made lying feel pointless and silence feel wasteful. She told him about the clause on the 4th page. She told him about the 3 lawyers. She told him about coming to the auction and standing in the crowd and watching Edgar Holt laugh. Benjamin Redmond listened to all of it without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He watched her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know a man in Wichita. His name is Clarence Marsh. He is the best contract lawyer in the state of Kansas, and he has no love for Edgar Holt, because Holt tried the same trick with a rancher named Amos Whitfield 2 years ago, and Marsh lost that case, and it has bothered him ever since." Louisa looked at him. "Why would he take my case?" "Because I will ask him to," Benjamin said simply. "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes. Because your father was my neighbor and my friend for 6 years, and I watched him work that land and love it, and what Holt did to him is wrong. It was designed to be wrong. And because he started again. Because you are sitting here alone in a boarding house with no allies and nowhere left to turn, and I have both of those things in excess, and it would be a sin not to offer them. Louisa felt the familiar urge to say she did not need help. She had been saying it for 11 months, through every closed door and every condescending attorney, and every morning she woke up in the boarding house instead of in her own house, and it had gotten her exactly nowhere. "I do not know you," she said instead. "No," he agreed. "But I knew your father, and he was a man worth knowing, and I suspect you are too." She looked at him for a long time. The light in Mrs. Crane's kitchen was the warm amber of late morning, and it fell across Benjamin Redmond's face and showed her nothing she needed to be afraid of. He was steady. He was honest. He was offering help without any visible expectation of what that help might purchase him. In her experience, that was the most dangerous kind. "I will think about it," she said. He nodded, replaced his hat, and thanked her for the coffee that Mrs. Crane had actually made, not Louisa, and rode back out of town on his roan horse. She thought about it for exactly one day. She thought about her father's hands, thick and scarred from 30 years of farming, and how he had worked that land as if it were a member of the family and not just a piece of ground. She thought about the 4 pages of the contract and the clause that had swallowed everything he had built. She thought about Edgar Holt's silver watch chain and his comfortable laugh, and the way he had not once, not for a single second at the auction, looked guilty. She thought about Benjamin Redmond, who had noticed her watching when no one else had, and what that said about the quality of his attention. On the second morning, she walked to the telegraph office on Main Street and sent a wire to the Redmond Cattle Company, 3 miles north on the Salt Fork of the Arkansas, and it said only, "I accept your offer of assistance. When can we leave for Wichita?" The reply came back within the hour. It said, "Tomorrow morning. I will bring a proper wagon, and Mrs. Crane is welcome to chaperone if it eases your mind." She smiled despite herself. It was the first time she had smiled in 11 months. Mrs. Crane did not come. She had a boarding house to run and a bad knee and absolutely no desire to ride to Wichita, but she stood on her front porch the next morning as Benjamin Redmond pulled up in a well-made spring wagon with 2 good horses and said to Louisa quietly, "That is a decent man. I have known his family for years. You could do a great deal worse than to trust him." "I am not trusting him," Louisa said, picking up her bag. "I am accepting a practical offer of assistance." Mrs. Crane made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement. The road to Wichita was 80 miles, and they did it in 2 days, camping the first night near the Chicaskia River under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. Benjamin made a fire without ceremony and produced bread and dried beef from a saddlebag, and they ate in the kind of comfortable silence that Louisa had spent her whole life in but had never shared with anyone outside her father. She noticed things about him on that road. The way he handled the horses, not with dominance but with a kind of ongoing conversation, adjusting his hands in response to what the animals told him. The way he thought before he spoke so that when he did speak it always meant something. The way he looked at the land they passed through, not as territory to be measured and exploited but as something with its own dignity, its own logic, its own beauty. "You have been ranching since you were young?" she asked, somewhere in the middle of the second day. "My father started the operation in 1860, he said. "I grew up on it, took it over when he died in 1875. It was just me and 3 hired hands for a long time." He paused. "Still is mostly. No family." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky above a stand of dry grass. "I was married," he said. "Her name was Catherine. She died of fever in the winter of 1878. "I am sorry," Louisa said, and meant it. "She was a good woman," he said. "She deserved better than this country gave her. There was grief in it, honest and old, the kind that does not perform itself but simply lives in a person quietly, like a room in a house that is always slightly cooler than the rest. Louisa recognized it. She lived in that kind of room herself. "My mother died when I was 9, she said. "Consumption. My father never really recovered. He just kept working because that was what he knew how to do." "Yes," Benjamin said, as if she had described something he understood completely. They said nothing else for a while, and the silence was not awkward but full, in the way that silences between people who have said something true tend to be. Clarence Marsh's office was on Douglas Avenue in Wichita, in a brick building that smelled of wood polish and old paper. Marsh himself was a small, precise man of about 50 with silver-rimmed spectacles, and the kind of contained energy that suggested a mind that never fully stopped working. He looked at Louisa's copy of the contract for a long time, turning pages slowly, and then he looked up at Benjamin. "Where did you find this woman?" he said. Not unkindly, but with the slightly startled air of a man who had been handed something interesting. "At an auction," Benjamin said. "She was watching Edgar Holt." Marsh looked at Louisa. "Smart woman." "I have been trying to be," Louisa said. "Can you help me?" Marsh took off his spectacles and cleaned them with a small cloth from his vest pocket. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There is a provision in Kansas contract law, adopted in 1876, that requires any agreement that creates an accelerated forfeiture clause to include explicit notice to the signing party in plain language, separate from the main body of the contract, acknowledging that they have been made aware of the forfeiture terms." He tapped the 4th page of the contract. "This clause, Miss Atwood, does not meet that standard. It is buried in ambiguous language and there is no separate notice. If your father did not receive such notice, and given the way this was drafted, I suspect he did not, the forfeiture is potentially void." Louisa felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been locked and frozen for 11 months. "Potentially," she said carefully. "Law is always potential until a judge says otherwise," Marsh said. "But I have seen worse cases succeed, and I have been waiting for a reason to go after Edgar Holt for 2 years. He looked at Benjamin. "You said you would cover the initial fees." "I said that," Benjamin confirmed. "Benjamin," Louisa began. "It is a loan," he said, "against the land at fair terms with no buried clauses. You can pay me back when this is resolved." She looked at him. He was looking at Marsh, and his expression was perfectly calm, as if what he had just offered was entirely ordinary and not, in fact, a significant financial commitment made on behalf of a woman he had known for less than a week. She thought about her father signing the first loan. She thought about how trust can be a door or a trap depending entirely on who is waiting on the other side of it. Benjamin Redmond was not Edgar Holt. She knew that already. In the deep instinctive way, she had always known things about the land. But knowing it and acting on it were different, and the distance between them was the exact length of every mistake she had promised herself not to repeat. "Fair terms," she said, "in writing, before we leave this office." Benjamin turned and looked at her, and something in his face changed, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if a puzzle piece had found its place. He nodded. "Agreed." Marsh drafted the loan agreement himself, in plain language, with every relevant term written out explicitly and no clauses on any page that were not also summarized clearly on the first. Louisa read every word. Then she looked at Marsh and said, "Page 3, second paragraph. The repayment window says 18 months. I would like it to be 24. Marsh looked at Benjamin. 24, Benjamin said without hesitation. She signed it. It was, she thought, the most carefully she had ever signed anything in her life. And when she handed the pen back to Marsh and looked up at Benjamin, there was something new in the air between them, something that had not been there before. It was not yet warmth, exactly. It was more like the first evidence of warmth, the way the air changes in February when spring is still weeks away, but something has shifted and you can feel it if you are paying attention. The legal process took longer than Louisa wanted and shorter than she feared. Marsh filed in the Sumner County District Court in October, and the case was heard in January of 1883 before a judge named Harlan Whitmore who was known, Marsh told them, for his careful reading of the letter of the law and his absolute refusal to be impressed by expensive suits. In the months between filing and hearing, Louisa stayed at the Redmond ranch. This had not been the plan. The plan had been for her to return to Mrs. Crane's boarding house and wait. But in November, the boarding house caught fire from a chimney fault, and while no one was hurt and the structure survived, it was uninhabitable through the winter repairs, and Mrs. Crane herself went to stay with her daughter in Newton. Louisa had no other options in Caldwell that she could afford, and Benjamin's ranch was 3 miles from the land that was supposed to be hers, and he had 3 spare rooms and hired help that included a capable older woman named Rosa Delgado, who served as housekeeper, and whose presence in the household meant that Louisa's staying there would not set every tongue in the county wagging any more than it already would. Rosa Delgado was a Mexican-born widow of about 50 who had worked for the Redmond family for 12 years. She was practical and warm, and had the comfortable authority of a person who runs a house as they see fit and expects everyone else to fall in line accordingly. She showed Louisa to a room that faced east, with good morning light and a window that looked out over the Salt Fork bottoms, and said, "You will have privacy and you will have hot food and you will not be a burden. Benjamin told me about your situation. I am glad he brought you here." "He did not exactly bring me," Louisa said. "It was more circumstance." Rosa looked at her with the faintly amused expression of a woman who has seen enough to know better. "If you say so," she said. Living at the Redmond ranch was nothing like what Louisa had expected, largely because she had expected it to be awkward, and it was not. Benjamin's household had a rhythm to it: early mornings, hard work, meals at regular times, quiet evenings, that was almost identical to the rhythm of her childhood home. She slipped into it without effort, the way a river slips back into an old channel after a flood. She helped Rosa in the kitchen when she was not doing the more outdoor work she was drawn to, checking the fence lines that bordered what had been her father's property, walking the bottomland in the pale November light, reading the soil with her hands the way her father had taught her. The land was still there, still rich, still hers in every way that mattered except on paper. Holt had not done anything with it yet. He was waiting for prices to improve, Marsh had told them. He thought he had all the time in the world. He did not know about Clarence Marsh. Benjamin gave her space and time and a horse to ride, a steady buckskin mare named Clover who had the ideal temperament for a person who needed to think while she moved, and he did not ask her questions she had not offered to answer. But he was there, reliably and without drama, in the evenings after supper when the hired hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Rosa had retired and the ranch house was quiet. They sat sometimes by the stove with books or papers between them, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and both felt natural. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a landscape, gradually, by moving through it at different times and in different light. She learned that he had studied law briefly in Missouri before deciding he could not stand being indoors and had come back to the ranch. She learned that he had a gift for mental mathematics that he was slightly embarrassed by because it impressed people in a way that felt immodest. She learned that he had tried, 3 years after Catherine's death, to court a woman in Caldwell, and that it had not gone anywhere, not because of any failing on either side, but because they had both been, in the end, performing something neither of them actually felt. She learned that he had been lonely for a long time, and that he had made his peace with it in the way that strong and private people do, by building a life so full of work and purpose that the loneliness had somewhere productive to go. She recognized that, too. "You never thought to remarry after Catherine?" She asked one evening in December, not because she was asking about herself, but because she was genuinely curious about him, which was a feeling she had almost forgotten how to have. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stove. "I thought about it," he said, But thinking about it and wanting it are different things. I wanted something real. I was not willing to settle for the performance of it. No, she said softly. Neither was I. He looked at her. The stove light was warm and low, and the wind had been picking up outside for the past hour. The particular restless wind of a Kansas December that makes a house feel smaller and warmer and more essential. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the auction, with that direct and patient attention, and she felt it land differently than it had before. Less startling, more welcome. "Were you engaged?" he asked, "before all of this?" "Once," she said. "When I was 19. His name was Arthur Crane, no relation to Mrs. Elspeth. It is a common name. He was a farmer from the next county. We were betrothed for about 8 months. She paused. He left. He went to Colorado because someone told him there was silver there. He sent one letter. That was his loss, Benjamin said, and said it so simply and so completely without qualification that it hit her like something physical. She looked down at her hands. They were rough from work, from farm work and years of it, and she had never once been apologetic about that, but she was suddenly aware of them in a new way, the way you are suddenly aware of something when someone else is looking. "I'm not very good at this," she said, and then was surprised she had said it. "At what?" he asked. She looked up. "Being seen." He held her gaze. "You are better at it than you think," he said quietly. "And I am patient." She did not sleep easily that night. Not because anything had happened. Nothing had happened. He had not reached for her hand or said anything that was explicitly a declaration. But something had shifted, had moved past the careful professional distance they had both maintained so diligently. And she lay in the east-facing room with the wind outside and the warmth of the house around her, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the future was not simply a problem to be solved, but a place that might actually be worth arriving at. Christmas came to the ranch with Rose's cooking and a small cedar tree that one of the hired hands cut from the creek bottom, and no ceremony beyond what they made themselves. Benjamin gave Louisa a book, a novel, one she had mentioned admiring once in passing, and she gave him a pair of leather gloves she had stitched herself from scraps Rosa had helped her find. And they sat by the stove on Christmas evening after the hands had gone to their bunkhouse celebration, and Benjamin read aloud from the book, and she sat with her feet tucked under her on the opposite chair and listened to his voice, which was unhurried and clear, and did not stumble over words. She thought, "I could live inside this feeling," and then she thought, "I must not get ahead of myself. Nothing is settled. The land is not back. The case is not won. I have no right to plan a future I have not yet secured." She went asleep with both thoughts in her, the warmth and the caution, like two fires burning on opposite sides of the same room. In early January, Marsh sent word that the hearing was set for the 14th. Louisa and Benjamin rode to Wellington together and met Marsh at the courthouse, a solid stone building on the main square that smelled of coal and wood smoke and the particular gravity of official proceedings. Edgar Holt arrived with his attorney, a man named Gerald Prout, who wore better clothes than Marsh and had the polished manner of someone accustomed to winning on presentation alone. Louisa sat behind the bar beside Marsh and kept her hands folded in her lap and her face still. She had dressed carefully, her best dress, deep blue wool, practical and neat, and she had pulled her dark hair back with precision. She was aware of being looked at. She always was. She kept her eyes on the judge. Edgar Holt sat across the aisle and did not look at her. He had the confidence of a man with money and lawyers and a signed contract and no reason to be worried. She watched him sidelong and felt nothing except a cold, clean anger that she had been keeping carefully contained for 14 months, and that was, she thought, going to be very useful in the next few hours. Judge Whitmore was exactly as Marsh had described. A compact man of about 60 with a level gaze and the manner of someone who had heard every variation of human dishonesty and was not impressed by any of them. He read the contract with the same patience and attention that Louisa had brought to it at her kitchen table, and he asked Marsh 3 specific questions about the 1876 provision, and he listened to Gerald Prout's counterarguments with the face of a man doing arithmetic. Then he was quiet for a long time. Holt shifted in his seat. Once, that was enough. Judge Whitmore put the contract down and said, in a tone that did not rise or fall, "The forfeiture clause on page 4 of this agreement does not meet the explicit notice requirements established in 1876. The signing party was not provided with separate, plain-language disclosure of the forfeiture terms. Under Kansas statute, this renders the forfeiture void. The land deed is returned to the estate of Thomas Atwood, and subsequently to his heir, Miss Louisa Atwood, effective immediately." The sound Holt made was not a word. His attorney made several words, but Judge Whitmore raised one hand and the words stopped. Louisa pressed her hands flat on the table. She did not trust herself to speak or move or do anything at all for one long moment. Marsh was writing something. He was very efficient about it. She turned and looked at Benjamin, who was in the gallery behind her, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not triumph, though it should have been, because he had done a great deal to make this happen, but something quieter and more private. He was looking at her the way she had looked at her father's land when she had walked it in November, with a recognition that went past words, a knowledge that this was where something important lived. She felt the crack in her chest that had been there since that first moment at the auction, when he had said, "You are not here for the cattle," and she felt it open the rest of the way, and it did not hurt. It was the opposite of hurt. It was the feeling of something that has been held too tight for too long finally letting go. Edgar Holt left the courthouse with his attorney and his silver watch chain and his confidence notably diminished, and he said nothing to anyone on the way out. He was not, Louisa suspected, a man who would simply disappear. Men like him never did, but he had lost his primary leverage, and without it, he was just a man who had tried to steal something and been stopped. She would learn later through Marsh, who kept his ear to the ground in the way that lawyers do, that Holt had tried the same forfeiture scheme with 2 other small farmers in the county, and that both of those cases, emboldened by the Atwood ruling, were re-examined over the following months and also reversed. Edgar Holt's land holding company quietly dissolved by spring. He relocated to Dodge City and was not heard from again in Sumner County. Justice in 1883 Kansas was not always swift or complete, but when it came with the solid finality of a judge's gavel, and Louisa Atwood felt every bit of it in her bones on the steps of the Wellington courthouse when Clarence Marsh handed her the revised deed to 140 acres of good Kansas bottomland with her name on it. Benjamin was standing beside her. He said nothing. He did not need to. She said, "I need to thank you properly." "You do not," he said. "I do," she said. "What you did, the lawyer, the fees, the ranch, everything. It was," she stopped. "It was extraordinary, and I do not know why you did it. I mean, I know what you said about my father and about what was right, but I need to know if there was more to it than that." The January wind was cold and had the bite of more snow coming. The square around them was busy in the way of county seats, horses and wagons and people with business to do, and they were standing in the middle of it with a land deed between them and the question she had finally asked hanging in the air. Benjamin looked at the deed in her hands. Then he looked at her. "The first reason was exactly what I said," he told her. "Your father was a good man and it was wrong. That was true and complete, and it would have been enough." "And the second reason?" she asked. "The second reason," he said slowly, "is that from the moment you said neither are you to me at that auction, I did not want to stop talking to you. And I have spent the last 4 months trying to give you enough space to trust me and enough presence to make it clear that I was worth trusting. And I am not sure I have done it well, but I have done it as honestly as I know how." Louisa looked at him. The wind pulled at her hair. She thought about all the walls she had built and all the space he had given her, and all the evenings by the stove and the Christmas book, and the way he had said it was his loss without any qualification at all. "You did it well," she said quietly. He reached out and took one of her hands very gently, the way he handled his horses, not with dominance but with ongoing attention, with a question in it rather than an assumption. She let him. She held his hand back, and it was warm and solid and real in the cold air, and it felt like the first thing that had felt like the future in a very long time. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon as they had arrived, but everything was different, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The snow started about 10 miles from home, gentle and steady, and by the time they reached the ranch it had covered the bottomland in white, and the house was lit from inside where Rosa had kept the stove burning and the lamp on the window sill. Rosa looked at their faces when they came through the door and then looked at the deed in Louisa's hand and said, "Good," in the tone of a woman who had been expecting a particular outcome and was satisfied to see it arrive. Then she said, "I made soup," and went back to the kitchen. Benjamin laughed. It was the first time Louisa had heard him laugh fully, without restraint, and it was a good sound, warm and genuine, the laugh of a man whose whole self was in it. She laughed too. February arrived and Louisa moved to her own land, which was what she had always intended to do, but the moving was different than she had imagined it because it was not an escape to something familiar but a return to something she was building new. The house was still standing. Holt had not touched the house, only the deed, and the house was solid if cold and in need of attention. She lit fires in every room and opened every window one morning to let the winter air through, and then closed them all again and stood in the kitchen where her father had stood for 20 years and held her own hands together and cried. She cried for a while. It was necessary and she did not fight it. Then she got to work. Benjamin was there most days, not in the way of a man who could not leave, but in the way of a neighbor who had made it his business to be useful. He brought supplies. He helped shore up the barn roof where a winter storm had weakened it. He sent one of his hired hands, a capable young man named Marcus Webb, to help with the fence repairs that the property needed after a winter of no maintenance. And he came for supper on the evenings when Louisa cooked, and she fed him and they sat at the table that had been her father's and talked about everything. The land, the cattle operation, the politics of the county, books they had read, things they believed, things they feared. They talked with the ease of people who have passed through something difficult together, and found that they fit around each other's edges without effort or negotiation. He kissed her for the first time in March, on the porch of her father's house on an evening when the first warmth had finally broken the back of winter and the air smelled of new grass and creek water. He had been leaving, had stood up from his chair and put on his hat, and then had stopped and looked at her in a way that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks, and she stood up too, and they were very close, and he said, "May I?" in the quiet, direct way he had of asking questions, and she said, "Yes." It was not complicated. It was the simplest thing in the world. It was the feeling of two people who have been careful for a long time, finally deciding that careful is not what is needed anymore. Spring on the Salt Fork was something that had to be lived to be understood. The land unclenched from winter with a reluctance and then a rush, the creek rising and the grass coming up thick and green, and the cottonwoods leafing out along the water in that particular bright yellow-green of new growth that lasted only a week before deepening. Louisa planted the kitchen garden and started planning the crop rotation and rode the fence lines on clover, who Benjamin had offered to sell her at a price she knew was below fair market, and which she accepted because arguing about it would have been its own kind of foolishness. She was happy. She noticed it with some surprise, not because happiness was foreign to her, but because she had stopped expecting it, somewhere in the long gray year of her father's death and the battle for the land, and finding it now was like finding a room in your own house that you had forgotten was there. Benjamin asked her to marry him in April. He did it at the kitchen table after supper, with the dishes cleared and the lamp burning between them, and he did it in the way that was entirely consistent with who he was, without theater, without manipulation, without any of the performance she had been braced against her whole adult life. He said he loved her. He said he wanted to build something permanent with her if she would let him. He said he understood that she had fought very hard for her independence and her land, and that she might not want to attach either of those things to another person's name. And if that was the case, he would respect it. "But I would like," he said, "to ask the question because not asking it seemed dishonest." Louisa sat across from him and thought about honesty, which had become the standard by which she measured everything important. She thought about her father's land and her own name on the deed. She thought about the 12 months she had spent alone and the 4 months she had spent not alone and the difference between the two. "Would I keep the Atwood name?" she asked. He blinked. "Then, I had not considered it." "Would you want to?" "My father built that land under that name," she said. "I would like it to stay in the ground, but I would also like—" She stopped. He was not, as she had told him months ago, very good at being seen, but she was better at it than she had been. He had been patient. "I would also like to be a Redmond if there is a way to be both." Benjamin looked at her with the kind of quiet joy that does not shout itself but simply fills a space completely. "I believe the law allows a woman to use whatever name she chooses," he said, "and I believe you know the law better than most." "I am learning," she said. "Yes or no, Louisa?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He smiled, she smiled. It was, in its simplicity, the most significant moment of her life since she had stood in this same kitchen with her hands on her father's contract, and decided she was not going to let the ground be taken from under her. They married in June of 1883 at the small church in Caldwell, with Clarence Marsh as a witness and Rosa Delgado as the other, and Mrs. Elspeth Crane, whose boarding house had been repaired and reopened by then, weeping quietly in the front pew as if she had always known it would come to this. Marcus Webb and the other hands from the Redmond ranch sat in a row in their best clothes and looked collectively as if they had bet on something and won. Judge Whitmore attended because Benjamin had sent him an invitation as a mark of genuine gratitude, and the judge accepted it with what Marsh reported was the nearest thing to a smile he had produced in a courtroom setting in 20 years. The ceremony was short, and the words were plain. Benjamin said his vows with his eyes on her face, not the book, and Louisa said hers with the same clarity she had brought to every contract she had ever read, every deed she had ever signed, every decision she had ever made that actually mattered. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation applauded in the warm summer church, and Benjamin took both her hands and said quietly, so that only she could hear, "I have been waiting a long time for something like this." "So have I," she said, and she leaned up and kissed him in front of the minister and the witnesses and Mrs. Crane's happy weeping and all of it, because careful was not what was needed. The summer was the fullest summer of Louisa Atwood Redmond's life. She and Benjamin worked both properties together, the ranch and the farm, running them as a single operation in a way that made both more productive and both more manageable. Benjamin's cattle had always needed better winter pasture, and Louisa's bottomland provided it. Louisa's farm had always needed a larger labor force in harvest season, and Benjamin's hands provided it. The two places fit together as naturally as the people who owned them. Rosa Delgado came to the farm 3 days a week, and the ranch too, and managed both kitchens with her customary efficiency and no apparent strain. She taught Louisa to make proper chili verde, and Louisa taught her the bread recipe her mother had brought from Missouri, and they found in each other the kind of companionship that women build when they are both too practical for nonsense and too warm to be cold. Louisa learned the cattle operation with the same determined intelligence she brought to everything. She had always understood animals. The farm had always had pigs and chickens and the occasional dairy cow. But the scale of cattle ranching was different, and the economics of it were different, and she found in Benjamin a teacher who was thorough without being condescending, and who took her questions seriously rather than charming them away. By autumn she could read the condition of the herd as confidently as she read her crop fields, and she could talk prices and markets with the buyers who came through in a way that made Benjamin's hired men exchange glances that were, she came to understand, deeply approving. "They respect you," Benjamin told her one evening after a cattle buyer from Wichita had left, having paid slightly more than the posted price, because Louisa had engaged him in a conversation about market conditions that had impressed him considerably. "They have since about June. I think they respected me when I showed up at your ranch in October with a bad situation and no intention of folding," Louisa said. "That too," he agreed. The fall of 1883 brought a good harvest, the best on the Atwood land in several years, the soil having been rested somewhat in the year of the legal dispute when it was not farmed. And they ended the year with the ranch accounts in the best shape Benjamin had seen in a decade, and the farm accounts in the black for the first time since Louisa's father had taken out the fateful loan. Clarence Marsh came out in November to help Louisa draft a new legal structure for the combined operation, and she paid him properly this time, from her own account, and he accepted it with the professional satisfaction of a man who likes his loose ends tied. "The Atwood ruling is being cited in 2 other cases in Kansas right now," Marsh told her over supper at the ranch. "The forfeiture notice provision, it is becoming useful precedent." "Good," Louisa said. "My father deserved better than what he got. If his situation can protect someone else from the same thing, I am glad of it." Marsh raised his coffee cup. "To Thomas Atwood," he said. They all raised their cups. Benjamin caught Louisa's eye across the table, and she saw in his face the same thing she felt in herself. The bittersweet satisfaction of justice, done too late for the person who deserved it most, but done completely enough that it echoed forward into other lives and other futures. It was not everything. It would never be everything, but it was not nothing either. Winter came again, the second winter, and this one was entirely different from the first. The ranch house was full in the evenings, Benjamin reading, Louisa writing in the journal she had started keeping in the spring, Rose's humming from the kitchen while she finished things up for the night, the smell of the wood stove and coffee, and sometimes the particular clean cold that came in when someone opened a door. The hired men were settled and the animals were well, and the land was sleeping under its thin layer of frost and waiting, as it always did, for spring. On a December evening, with the snow coming down outside the same way it had on the day they rode back from the Wellington courthouse, Louisa looked up from her journal and said, "I think we are going to have a child." Benjamin looked up from his book. He said nothing for a moment. The stove ticked. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Fairly certain," she said. I have noticed, for about a month. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He put the book down very carefully, in the way of a man managing a strong feeling with deliberate gentleness. He stood up. He came to her chair and crouched down beside it and took her hand, and he looked at her face with the full attention that was the thing she had noticed first about him at an auction in September when no one else was paying attention to anything except numbers. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "Yes," she said. "I am well. I am very well, actually." He pressed her hand to his face very briefly with his eyes closed, and she felt him breathe, one long, slow breath, and she understood what it contained. The grief for Catherine, who had not survived the winter of 1878, and the fear that lived alongside every joy in a man who had already lost, and the size of what he was feeling now in this kitchen in this winter with this woman who had come to him through a cattle auction and a stolen land deed and all the difficult particular luck of their 2 lives. "I am here," she said quietly. "I am not going anywhere." He opened his eyes. They were bright. "I know," he said. She brought her other hand up and cupped his face, and he leaned into it, and they stayed that way for a while with the snow coming down outside, and the stove burning and the whole deep settled warmth of their life wrapped around them like something built rather than given. The child, a boy, was born in July of 1884, into a summer so hot and golden that Louisa always associated him with the smell of dry grass and creek water, and the particular blue of a Kansas sky at noon. They named him Thomas Benjamin Redmond, for the grandfather he would never know but whose land he would grow up on, and for the father who was in the room when he was born, holding his wife's hand with such steady attentiveness that Rosa, who had seen births before and had firm opinions about the various ways men handled them, said afterward to Marcus Webb that it was, simply, the way it ought to be. Thomas was from the beginning a healthy and opinionated baby who slept in unpredictable intervals, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's exact expression of focused assessment. Louisa nursed him and talked to him and carried him in a shawl while she did the lighter farm work, and he observed the world from this vantage point with apparent satisfaction. Benjamin held him at every opportunity and showed him things with the same patient explanatory attention he brought to everything: the horses, the cattle, the mechanics of the well, the way the creek moved differently in different seasons. And Thomas listened to all of it with the deep seriousness of a baby who has no idea what he is hearing, but recognizes the quality of attention being paid. Clarence Marsh came out in the fall and was declared Thomas's godfather, which he accepted with the slightly alarmed dignity of a man who has no children of his own and has been suddenly assigned an important role. He brought a beautifully bound children's book from Wichita and held Thomas at arm's length with great care and looked at him with the expression of a man doing complex calculations. "He has her eyes," he told Benjamin. "He has her everything," Benjamin said, "except the temperament, which appears to be entirely original." "Lord help you," Marsh said, and handed the baby back. The second winter, with Thomas in the house, was louder than the previous ones and also somehow deeper in its warmth, as if his presence had thickened the air with something necessary. Louisa rocked him in the evenings and Benjamin read aloud. The books had expanded to include things a child could follow, fables and stories with pictures that Thomas reached for with his small, certain hands. And Rosa made soup, and the ranch ran on, and the land waited under its frost, and all the difficult history that had brought them here lay quiet and resolved beneath everything, like bedrock under good soil. In the spring of 1885, Louisa planted the kitchen garden with Thomas on a blanket in the sun beside the fence, and he watched her work with his serious dark eyes and then fell asleep in the warm air. And she straightened up and looked out at the bottomland, at the good black soil her father had broken, and the cottonwoods along the creek and the grass coming up thick in the low places, and she felt in herself something that she had spent a long time not believing in. Not because she was a pessimistic person, but because the facts of her life had made optimism expensive. She felt, fully and without qualification, that things were as they should be. The Atwood land was hers. The Redmond cattle were thriving. The man she had married was a man worth marrying, which she had known before she said yes, and had confirmed in every subsequent season. Her son was asleep in the April sun. The contract that had tried to take everything from her family was overturned, and the man who had written it was gone from the county, and 2 other families were better protected because of it. Her father's name was on the deed and on the boy sleeping on the blanket, and it would be on this land for as long as the Redmonds worked it. She went back to her planting. Benjamin came over from the fence line where he had been checking the new posts Marcus had put in and stopped at the edge of the garden to look at her and then at Thomas and then at her again. He had the look he often had in quiet moments, that particular combination of gratitude and attentiveness that she had come to understand as the way love looks on a person who is paying full attention to what they have. "How is he?" Benjamin asked, nodding at Thomas. "Asleep," she said, "which is not going to last." "No," he agreed, "it never does." He came to stand beside her and they looked together at the garden, at the boy, at the land, at the creek glinting through the cottonwoods in the April light. "I was thinking," Benjamin said, "about the south parcel. The Morley family has been renting it and the lease comes up in August. I thought perhaps we might use it ourselves this year, expand the winter pasture." "I was thinking the same thing," Louisa said, "and I thought we might put the north edge under wheat. The soil there is different from the rest, more clay. It would hold moisture well in a dry year." He looked at her. "You have been thinking about this." "I think about the land constantly," she said. "You knew that when you married me." "I did," he said. "I consider it an extraordinary feature," she laughed. Thomas stirred on his blanket and did not wake. The garden waited. The land stretched out around them under the spring sky, belonging to all of them, carrying all of their history in its good black soil. She thought briefly of the auction in September of 1882, of the crowd and the heat and the gavel's sound, and the man who had turned and looked at her when no one else had. She thought of the question she had expected, "What are you doing here?" and the observation she had gotten instead, "You are not here for the cattle." As if what she was actually doing mattered more than the permission she had to do it. As if seeing her clearly was more important than managing her. She thought of the walls she had built and the patience with which he had stood outside them, not trying to knock them down but simply being reliable enough that she had eventually opened the door herself. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes. I am glad you were watching." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have not stopped." And she believed him. She believed him entirely. 3 years later, in the summer of 1888, the garden was larger, and the cattle operation was the most productive it had been in the history of the Redmond family. And Thomas Redmond, 4 years old and already loud and certain about the world, had acquired a brother named James William Redmond, who arrived in May with considerable noise of his own and red hair that mystified everyone, since neither Benjamin nor Louisa had it, until Rosa reminded them that Louisa's mother had been a redhead, which Louisa had forgotten in the way that we sometimes forget things about people we lost when we were small. James William was called Will from the beginning because Thomas could not manage James and Will was easier and it stuck. Will had Louisa's temperament, watchful and precise, observing the world before engaging it, which made him somewhat easier in infancy than his brother had been, and which his father found deeply endearing because he recognized it. Thomas, by 4, was Benjamin in miniature, steady, direct, interested in everything, with a talent for going quietly at problems until they yielded. He followed Benjamin around the ranch with the dedicated focus of an apprentice, and asked questions in rapid succession, and retained every answer perfectly, and moved on to the next question. He had recently become very interested in the cattle, and had begun to understand, at a basic level, the logic of grazing and pasture rotation, which his father explained patiently, and which Louisa supplemented with drawings at the kitchen table on rainy afternoons. Clarence Marsh came for Will's baptism and stood again in his godfather capacity, this time with slightly less alarm and considerably more confidence. He had, in the 4 years since Thomas's birth, developed a relationship with the Redmond household that could only be described as family, appearing 3 or 4 times a year from Wichita with books and news of the legal world, and an appetite for Rosa's cooking that was one of the more consistent things about him. "2 boys," he said, looking from Thomas to the baby with the air of a man contemplating an actuarial table. "You are building an army. We are building a family," Louisa said firmly. In Kansas, in 1888, with those 2, the distinction may not be meaningful. She laughed. Will chose this moment to make a sound of profound displeasure, which he directed at no one in particular and with considerable conviction, and Marcus Webb, who had been with the ranch for 6 years now, and considered himself an uncle by proximity and tenure, scooped him up from the blanket with the easy competence of someone who had been handling babies since Thomas's arrival, and said something low and nonsensical and effective, and Will subsided. Thomas observed all of this with his dark, serious eyes and said to his father gravely, "He is loud." "He is," Benjamin agreed. "Was I loud?" "You were the loudest person in 3 counties, Benjamin said. Thomas considered this. "I am quieter now," he said. "You are," Benjamin said. "You improved significantly." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking at the cattle. Louisa watched her family moving around her in the August sun, her husband and her sons and Rosa and Marcus, and the hands she had come to know well over 6 years of shared work, and she felt the completeness of it in a way that was not complacency but its opposite. She was not settling into ease. She was actively living inside something she had built and fought for, and the difference between those 2 things was exactly the difference between her life before and her life now. The land was under her feet. It had always been under her feet, even in the boarding house, even in the long gray winter of the legal battle. She had carried it with her the way you carry the knowledge of something essential. Her father's work was in the soil and in the deed, and now in her son's name. The injustice done to Thomas Atwood had been corrected in the courts and extended forward into other cases, and was, in the small and real way that law works, part of the protection offered to the next farmer who found himself facing a buried clause and a man with a silver watch chain. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The fall of 1888 brought a good harvest and the news that the county was expanding its school district, which meant that Thomas would start school the following year, which he already knew and had opinions about. The winter brought the first real snowstorm in years, the kind that kept everyone inside for 3 days and filled the house with the particular claustrophobic warmth of people who love each other and cannot escape each other. And it was, on balance, wonderful. Benjamin read aloud every evening that winter, with Thomas on one side and Will, who was not yet old enough to follow the stories but liked the sound, on his lap. And Louisa sat across from them with her mending, and listened to her husband's voice in the lamplight and thought about September of 1882, about a woman who had stood at an auction with her walls up and her future uncertain, and everything she valued in jeopardy, and about the man who had been the only one to notice she was watching. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not managed, not performed for, not told who you were, but actually seen, with full and patient attention, the way Benjamin Redmond saw everything he decided was worth his time. She had been worth his time. She had known it, somewhere in the deep instinctive place where she knew things about soil and weather and the quality of other people's honesty. She had known it and been afraid of it and been careful about it and ultimately let it be true, and it had given her back her land and given her a family, and given her a life in which the future was not a problem to be solved, but a place they were building together, one season at a time. Rosa Delgado retired from regular work in 1890, when her own daughter in Newton had a second child and needed help, and the farewell supper Louisa made for her was, by Rosa's own assessment, the best meal Louisa had ever cooked, which was not something Rosa said lightly. They embraced in the kitchen and Rosa said, in her direct way, "Your father would be proud of you, not because of the land, because of who you are." Louisa held on for a moment longer than she intended to. "I learned some of that from you," she said. "You learned most of it from yourself," Rosa said, "but I am glad I was here for the rest." She went to Newton and they exchanged letters, and she came back for Thomas's first communion and for Will's 4th birthday, and for the baptism of the child who arrived in the spring of 1892. A girl this time, small and dark-haired and with her father's river-water eyes, who they named Catherine Louisa Redmond, for the woman Benjamin had lost in 1878, and for the woman who had found him again, which Louisa had suggested herself and which had made Benjamin very quiet for a long time. "Are you certain?" he had said when she suggested the name. "She deserved to be remembered," Louisa said, "and Catherine is a beautiful name, and I am not afraid of what came before us, Benjamin." "I never have been." He looked at her with the full attention that had never in 10 years diminished. "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I love most about you." Catherine Louisa Redmond was, from her first days, the kind of person who observed everything before acting on any of it, which her mother recognized with a feeling that was half amusement and half mere recognition. She had her mother's stillness and her father's patience, and a temper that emerged rarely but with considerable precision, which her brothers learned to respect by the time she was old enough to express it. Thomas and Will raised her as brothers raise a youngest sister, with a mixture of protection and minor harassment that was entirely affectionate in both directions. She followed them around the ranch from the time she could walk and had opinions about horses before she was 3, which was consistent with being raised in the particular household she had been placed in by the specific luck of the world. By 1895, The Redmond operation on the Salt Fork was known throughout Sumner County as one of the best-run combined farms and cattle ranches in the region. Louisa had long since expanded the wheat fields on the north parcel and had added a small dairy component that supplied the town of Caldwell with milk and cream through a sensible arrangement with a merchant named Gillies, and Benjamin had increased the herd to a size that required 2 additional full-time hands and a new section of fence line that ran 1.5 miles along the creek. Thomas was 11 and deeply serious about cattle. Will was 7 and deeply serious about mathematics, which Marsh found deeply satisfying on a personal level, and which Benjamin found somewhat mystical, as if a mathematical child were a naturally occurring phenomenon he had not quite expected to produce. Catherine was 3 and deeply serious about everything, which was the family consensus, and which her parents found alternately exhausting and magnificent. Louisa wrote to Clarence Marsh in the spring of 1895 on behalf of a young woman in Caldwell named Helen Pryor, whose husband had died and who was facing a situation with a creditor that had the characteristic smell of predatory lending. She wrote an extremely clear letter that laid out the relevant statutes and case precedents, including, centrally, Atwood v. Holt, which was now cited in contracts textbooks in 2 Kansas law schools, and suggested that Marsh might be willing to take the case at reduced rate given the circumstances. Marsh wrote back, "I was already aware of the prior situation. I believe her husband's family was involved in the Whitfield case, the one I lost before Atwood. Consider it handled." She read this letter aloud to Benjamin over supper. "You have become a force," he said. "I was always a force," she said. "I just needed the ground under me." He raised his coffee cup to her across the table. Thomas looked up from his book long enough to note that his parents were doing that thing they did sometimes, looking at each other with that particular expression that he was 11, and therefore too old to be charmed by, but was, in actual fact, quite moved by in a way he would not have admitted for any price. Will was doing mathematics on a scrap of paper. Catherine was asleep upstairs. The house was warm. The land was sleeping under its spring frost, getting ready for another year. The creek was running clear, and the cottonwoods were budding, and the cattle were settled in the back pasture, and the wheat seed was in the barn waiting. Benjamin and Louisa sat across from each other at Thomas Atwood's table, on Thomas Atwood's land, in the house that had been built by a man who had come to Kansas in 1868 with a dream and a sick wife, and a faith in the soil that had been tested and betrayed and ultimately vindicated. And they sat in the warmth of everything that had been built from his life, and from their love for each other, and from the specific and stubborn refusal, common to both of them, to let injustice be the last word. "I am going to check on Catherine," Louisa said, pushing back from the table. "She is fine," Benjamin said. "She was asleep." "She is my daughter, and I am going to check on her," Louisa said in the tone that ended conversations. Benjamin looked at his sons. Thomas made a small diplomatic gesture of neutrality. Will, without looking up from his mathematics, said, "You should probably just agree, Father." "He is 7, Benjamin said. "He is correct," Thomas said. Louisa was already upstairs. Benjamin drank his coffee and listened to the house, Thomas's quiet page-turning, Will's pencil on paper, the sound of Louisa's footsteps on the floorboards above, the creak of Catherine's door. The wind outside, which was gentle tonight, carrying the smell of the creek and the new grass. The last of the daylight going from the west window. He had been a man who was comfortable alone once. He had built a life out of work and purpose and the reliable seasons of the ranch, and he had lived in it honestly and without complaint. He had been lucky in his land and in his cattle and in the men who worked for him, and he had known it, and he had tried to be worthy of it. He had not known, standing at an auction in September of 1882, that he was about to find the best thing. He had noticed a woman standing at the edge of the crowd, not bidding, not socializing, not doing any of the things the people around her were doing. She was watching a man across the yard with the focused, contained attention of someone who had a purpose and was waiting for the right moment. She was the quietest person at the auction, in the way that still water is quiet, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that is happening deep. He had noticed her the way he noticed things that mattered, completely and without knowing at first why. He knew why now. Louisa came back downstairs and looked at his face and said, "What are you thinking?" "The auction," he said. "September of 1882. She sat back down across from him and put her chin in her hand. She was 35 years old and the finest person he knew, and she still had the capacity to make him feel, after 13 years, that she was in the process of seeing him clearly and that he had better be worth the assessment. "I was thinking about it too," she said, "a few minutes ago. I was afraid you were going to leave," he said. "That day, after I spoke to you, I thought you were going to simply walk away." "I almost did," she said. "I know." "But you said you were absolutely there for the cattle," she said. "And then you said, 'But I noticed you first,' and it was the truest thing anyone had said to me in a very long time." "It was true," he said simply. "I know," she said. That was the problem. Thomas put his book down and stood up and said he was going to bed with the efficiency of a child who has concluded that what is happening between his parents is private and that he is wise enough to recognize this. Will folded his mathematics paper and followed without being told, which suggested that he had been paying attention to the room at least part of the time. Benjamin waited until their footsteps had gone up the stairs and faded. "Louisa," he said. "Benjamin." "I would do it again," he said. "Every part of it, the auction and marsh and the courthouse and all of it. I would do it again from the start." She looked at him. The lamp was burning between them and the house was quiet and the land was outside in the dark, both pieces of it, the ranch and the farm, running together along the Salt Fork the way their lives had run together since that September day. "So would I," she said. "Every difficult part of it, because it brought me here." She reached across the table and he took her hand, in the way he had taken it on the courthouse steps in January of 1883, with the question in it rather than the assumption, and she held it back. And they stayed that way while the last of the evening settled into night outside and the creek ran on in the dark, and the land held them and their children and all their history quietly, as good land does, without comment and without end. The spring came, as it always did, with its particular rush after the long patience of winter. The wheat came up on the north parcel, thick and even. The cattle moved to the new spring pasture. Thomas rode the fence lines on the horse Benjamin had given him for his 10th birthday, a steady gray that matched his temperament exactly. Will did mathematics at the kitchen table, and occasionally looked up from them to have opinions about things. Catherine followed her father through the barn in the mornings with focused attention, and asked questions in such rapid succession that even Benjamin, who was patient with questions on a professional level, occasionally had to ask her to give him a moment. The Salt Fork ran clear and cold and bright in the April sun. The cottonwoods along the bank were coming into leaf, that brief, brilliant yellow-green that lasted only a week and that Louisa had loved her whole life. She stood at the fence of her father's garden, her garden now, for 12 years, and before that his for 20, and looked out over the bottomland with the spring sun on her face and felt the ground under her feet, solid and real and entirely hers. She heard Benjamin's voice from the barn, explaining something to Catherine with patient thoroughness, and she heard Catherine's reply, which was 3 more questions, and she heard Benjamin's brief pause before he answered the first one, and she smiled. The land stretched out before her, dark and rich and ready. Her father's soil, her son's future, her family's foundation. She pressed the heel of her boot into it, feeling the give of spring earth, and thought of everything it had taken to stand here, and of everything it had been worth. She went inside to start the morning. Behind her, the creek ran on, and the cottonwoods shook their new leaves in the light, and the Salt Fork bottomland lay in the April sun exactly as it always had. Patient, enduring, full of the particular quiet promise of good ground that has been worked with love and defended with courage and passed forward, intact and fertile, into the days still to come.